Hey guys, TechNature here with the video for you guys. In today's video, we're going to be comparing the iPhone SE, both of them, the first edition with the iPhone second edition here, in a head-to-head comparison. We're going to talk about everything that you need to know between these two phones. These two phones are one of the outlier phones of the Apple lineup, and a lot has changed between these two devices. And in this video, we're going to cover everything from hardware, the software, and the overall build of these two phones in 2021. Whether you're looking to upgrade from one to another or in the market to buy one of these two phones, we're going to talk about everything that you need to know. But before we go ahead and get started, if you guys are new to our channel, we do a lot of tech news, reviews, and giveaways, so make sure to hit that subscribe button. Also, if you guys are in the market for one of the newer phones like the iPhone SE second edition or newer iPhones out there, make sure you guys check out the discounted link in the description section. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with today's review of the iPhone SE lineup. So let's talk about the iPhone SE here, the first edition. It was released in March of 2016, and then 4 years later the iPhone SE here in April of 2020 was released. So 4 years apart of these two phones, and a lot has changed. One thing that we did kind of hear about is the rumor between these two phones, what kind of phones these are, because these aren't quite the flagship phone in the Apple lineup, is that we hear that the iPhone SE, the first one, was sort of a redesign or sort of using the spare parts from the iPhone 5 and the 5S lineup, and you can kind of tell between that because of the body design and a lot of things. So that's one of the things we hear, is that the iPhone SE might have been just Apple reusing its production lineup with the spare or leftover parts, but still a great phone. And the same thing happened when the iPhone SE second edition was released here, is that we kind of hear that the iPhone SE here that we have was sort of a rebuild or pretty much a clone of the iPhone 8 lineup. In a lot of ways, when we did a review, we see that similarities here. It almost seems that Apple has sort of reused the spare parts for the iPhone 8 lineup to build the SE because of the similarities in a lot of ways. And that's one thing we want to just get off right off the bat here. Let's talk about the build of these two phones. Of course, a lot of difference between these two phones, and the first thing you'll notice is the size difference between these two phones. The iPhone SE here, the first edition, versus the second one, is that size display here. The iPhone first edition has a 4.0 display versus the iPhone SE here, the second edition, which has a 4.7 display, which seems to be the standard for the iPhone 6, 7, and the 8 lineup here for the base model. So that's the standard body of these two phones. Of course, the other thing you'll notice is, of course, when we look at the back here between the phones, is that difference of body. The back on the iPhone SE second edition here is the glass back, where the iPhone here, the first edition, has just that metal aluminum body to it. And this is why the material build is different between these two phones. You have this aerospace material build on the iPhone SE second edition here, compared to just that aluminum metal like body on the iPhone first edition here. Of course, the other thing you'll notice is that almost a bigger camera, it looks like, but the cameras are actually both 12 megapixel camera. Of course, the Apple logo here shifted on the iPhone second edition, and you'll see Apple removing all this extra notice information between it. And this is a special unique design, the product red one, which the iPhone first edition doesn't come in. Other thing you'll notice between these two phones is the bezel on these two phones. You'll notice the iPhone second edition here, which has a rounded bezel, which starting with the iPhone 6 lineup, Apple has introduced. And the interesting thing about the iPhone SE here is that this design was brought back on the 12 lineup. So if you take iPhone 12 right now, you'll see that Apple went back to that flat, more defined bezel on it. Not sure why Apple has done that, but that's one interesting thing we noticed between these two phones. So first edition and the second edition. Other thing to note, of course, is the weight of these two phones. The iPhone SE, your typical 4.87 display, weighs just a little over 6 ounces, where the iPhone first edition here weighs just under 4 ounces, almost 2.5 ounce heavier because of that bigger body to it. Of course, talking about the bigger body, both of these two phones are built in similarly for their display here. If we took a look at the display between these two phones, is that iPhone second edition here, both of them does have Retina HD display. Retina display. The iPhone second edition here has HD display, which isn't possible on the iPhone first edition here. You'll notice they also have similar contrast ratio between it, but the iPhone SE here has a 1400 to 1 versus the iPhone first edition here has an 800 to 1, so almost 600 contrast ratio. The resolution actually is pretty similar, but just a little bit ahead on the iPhone SE second edition, which is 1334 by 750 compared to the first edition, which is 1136 by 642. And other thing you'll notice between these two phones is that the iPhone SE here has things like True Tone display, your haptic touch feedback, and of course the max brightness of 625, which on the iPhone first edition has around 500 nit of max brightness between these two phones. The other thing to notice about the hardware is that the iPhone SE second edition here is water resistant, unlike the iPhone first edition of the SE. It is not water resistant, so if you take it for a dive, you want to be careful. Of course, the iPhone second edition here, because it's front and back being all glass, is that if there's any cracks or anything, it could become compromised, and it's not going to be water resistant. Even if the screen is replaced on either of these two phones, you're going to lose water resistivity of both of these two phones. Let's talk about the memory size of these two phones. It's really important to talk about this because the fact is that Apple phones are built in with internal memory. You're not able to take a memory card and expand the phone's memory size of these two phones. The iPhone SE here at the base model comes at 64 gig, where the base model on the iPhone first edition of the SE is at 16 gig. Of course, we have the 32 gig here, but if you're looking to max out between these two phones, the iPhone SE is probably what you're going to be looking at. It is able to have a max internal storage of 256 gig compared to 120 gig, which is half on the first edition of the iPhone here. Other things to talk about between these two phones is camera. Camera is one thing you'll notice between these two phones. Of course, both of the phones does have 12 megapixel camera, but there has been a lot of improvement in the camera of these two phones. And the first thing improvement is that portrait mode, which isn't available on the first edition of it. And if you're really looking to enhance your photography skill, this is where the iPhone second edition would come to play. Other things you'll notice with this is your actual ability to record at max 4K. So the iPhone SE here is able to only record on 4K at 30 frames per second on the first edition, where the iPhone SE here, it goes from 24 all the way to 60 frames per second. So if you're looking for a better camera, iPhone SE is what you're going to get. And let's talk about the last hardware of these two phones is the fact of the chip on these two phones. When the Apple SE second edition came out here, Apple claimed that it is the smartest and fastest chip on any smart devices out there. And we've seen some of the benchmark where the iPhone did really pack a lot of punch to it, where on the iPhone SE here, of course, it does have a pretty much a full Apple developed chip on it, but it's not as powerful. It's the A9 chip compared to the A13 chip. It's a 4th generation of chip because of 4-year difference between it, and it does really pack a punch comparing on these two phones, especially when you're doing a lot of gaming and things like that. You'll probably notice that the iPhone SE here, because it has a better display and a bigger better hardware to it, actually, that it does able to deliver a lot of punch to it when you're looking to do a lot of things on the iPhone here. And let's talk about the battery life of these two phones. Both of the phones surprisingly have similar battery. This iPhone, the first edition, has around 1600 mAh versus around 1800 mAh battery on the second generation. And we've seen, because of a bigger body, when you look at video playback tests between these two phones, they get about the same 13 hours of video playback. Very shocking to see that even after 4 years between these two phones, that Apple hasn't done any good to the battery, or at least made the battery better on the iPhone 2nd edition here. And let's talk about the software part of these two phones. One of my favorite part, because this is probably what will differentiate between these two phones. Both of the phones are able to get iOS 14 updates to it, but the iPhone SE here is at the end of its life. It's not going to be getting the iOS 15 update compared to the iPhone 2nd edition here that we have. It's going to be getting at least another 3 to 4 years of major updates, because Apple supports its phones for about 4 to 5 years on the major updates, and Apple here on the SE first edition one has come to the end of life. Of course, that's not to say your major apps are still supported on both of these two phones. They work phenomenally well on both of the phones, but because the first edition, it's the end of its life, we probably wouldn't recommend it if you're looking for a phone to use in the long term compared to the iPhone 2nd edition here of it. So why might you get one phone versus the other? Well, let's talk about why you might get the first edition of the iPhone SE. Well, first thing first is that because of its smaller body and it's lighter, and that's probably one of the reasons you might get it. And of course, if you're really tight on budget, you can pretty much score the iPhone SE for under $100 right now. But and on honesty, you might be getting the 2nd edition of the iPhone SE because of a lot of features that you get on the iPhone SE. It's a smaller body phone, and it's a newer phone that still has that home button. So if you are still kind of looking for a home button on and looking to get updated features, but don't want to get that Face ID all screen resolution phones, you probably are going to be looking at the 2nd edition. It delivers around 11% more battery power, not a lot, but it still does give you that. It gives you a more internal RAM on it. The iPhone 2nd edition has 3 gig of RAM versus the iPhone 1st edition, which has 2 gigs of RAM. Of course, it has around 18% bigger size screen. It has around 38% better resolution to it because of that bigger display and updated display on it, but very similar in a lot of ways. And of course, it is water resistant. The camera here is definitely superior than the 1st edition of it because you have portrait mode. And of course, the other thing to mention is between these two phones is its water resistivity and dust resistivity, which the iPhone SE here doesn't get. And finally, is software updates. You're going to be able to update this phone for another 3 to 4 years, no doubt, maybe even 4 years on this phone, and that's why you probably are going to be looking at this phone. And this phone, if you're looking to buy right now, you're able to get it probably around $250, $300, maybe like 2 times or 3 times more than you would pay. But this phone is going to be relevant for years to come, and hence why we would probably recommend the iPhone SE 2nd edition over the 1st edition. Of course, the 2nd editions are always going to be better than the 1st edition. There you guys have it for our review of these two phones. We want to hear from you guys. What do you guys think about these two phones? Leave a comment in the comment section of whether you upgraded from one to another or using one of these two phones in 2021. Leave a comment in the comment section. Thanks for watching, guys. See you guys next time.